The Coke was icy as it ran down my face, soaking into my blouse, while the laughter of my son's executives echoed around me. My own son, my blood, looked at me with a smirk and called me a janitor as if decades of sacrifice meant nothing. In that moment, I wasn't just wet and humiliated. I was a mother staring at the boy I had raised and wondering how he had turned into this cruel stranger. But deep inside, beneath the shame, a quiet strength stirred. I was 58 years old, and I still held the power to remind him whose name was carved into the foundation of this company. The day would come when the truth would strip away his arrogance and leave him trembling. I wore a plain navy blouse and slacks, my hair tied back, simply my makeup minimal. Nothing about me suggested authority or ownership. I wanted it that way. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I signed in. I was given a visitor badge that dangled awkwardly around my neck, a reminder of how far I had allowed myself to fade into the background of my own legacy. The office felt heavy with silence. The old energy, the hum of collaboration, the laughter in hallways, was gone. Employees kept their heads down, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on their screens. Some cubicles stood empty, chairs pushed back as if abandoned in haste. I could feel the weight of decline in the air. Then the elevator doors opened. Ryan, my son, stepped out. He was 34 now, tall like his father, but sharper around the edges, his suit expensive, his smile practiced. He carried himself with the kind of arrogance only someone who thought he had already won could muster. Flanking him were his chosen lieutenants, Greg Thompson, the CFO, who always wore a watch too shiny for his salary, Tiffany Adams, operations director with a permanent smirk, Jordan Lee, the marketing VP, scrolling through his phone without looking up, and Ashley Perez, HR director, her eyes quick and calculating. They followed him like courtiers orbiting a king. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations cut off, chairs squeaked as people straightened their faces empty of expression. Fear, not respect, followed Ryan through the room. My stomach tightened. This was not the company Edward built. Morning, everyone. Ryan said, his voice loud enough to reach every corner. Conference room now. No warmth, no courtesy, just command. People gathered their things quickly. I followed, slipping into the back of the glass-walled room, notebook in hand, like any administrative assistant. Ryan sat at the head of the long table, tossing his phone down casually. He scanned the faces, eyes narrowing when they landed on me. "You," he said, suddenly pointing. His tone was sharp, dismissive. "What's your name, Margaret?" I answered quietly, heart steady though my face betrayed nothing. He tilted his head, smirk spreading. "Margaret, huh? You're new here, you look like you belong with the janitorial staff." A chuckle rippled from his team, eager to echo his cruelty. "Yeah, let's call you the janitor. That's all you're good for." The words sliced deeper than I expected. I had prepared myself for humiliation, but hearing my own son reduce me to nothing in front of strangers hit like a physical blow. I clenched my notebook tighter, forcing my face to stay calm. I told myself this was part of the plan. I needed to see who he had become. And here it was undeniable. "Bring me a Coke," Ryan added dismissively, waving his hand. "Diet? With ice? Not too much." I rose, walked to the break area, and returned with the drink, placing it carefully in front of him. He took one sip, then his expression twisted. "Are you kidding me?" His voice rose sharp and mocking. "This isn't diet. This is regular. Can you not follow the simplest instruction?" "I apologize," I said evenly, reaching for the can. "I'll replace." Before I could finish, Ryan stood abruptly and flung the cup at me. The cold liquid exploded across my face, soaking my blouse, dripping into my hair. Gasps whispered around the room, but no one moved. Coke ran down my neck, sticky and humiliating. My son, my own flesh and blood, leaned back with satisfaction. "Clean it up, janitor," he sneered, his voice echoing in the silence. I froze, every instinct screaming to shout, to reveal who I was, to demand respect, but I forced myself to stay still. My hands shook as I dabbed at the table with napkins, Coke dripping onto the polished wood. Around me, Greg smirked. Tiffany laughed softly. Jordan didn't look up from his phone, and Ashley whispered something to Ryan that made him grin wider. Only a few employees glanced my way with sympathy before quickly dropping their eyes. I excused myself and walked toward the restroom. Coke clinging to my skin, my clothes ruined. In the mirror, I saw a woman drenched and humiliated. Her reflection blurred by tears, she refused to let fall. But behind the wet hair and the sticky blouse were eyes burning with a cold, steady fire. He thought I was nothing. He thought I was just a janitor. He had no idea who I really was, or what power I still held in my hands. I pressed a paper towel to my face, smoothed back my hair, and whispered to my reflection, "Not yet, let him laugh today." Because soon, very soon, the truth would wipe that smirk from his face. I remembered when Collins Tech was just an idea scribbled on a napkin. Edward and I were in our tiny kitchen on the south side of Chicago long before we moved into the house with the oak staircase and the big dining room. He told me he wanted to build something that would outlast him, a company built on trust and hard work. I laughed at first, thinking it was another of his wild dreams, but he was relentless. He started with 1 client, then 3, then 10, until the name Collins Tech began to mean something in the Midwest. At our dinner table, those lessons were always part of the conversation. Ryan and Helen sat across from us, legs swinging under their chairs when they were little. Edward would lean forward, voice steady, explaining what integrity meant. "A man is only as good as his word," he'd say, cutting into his steak, while Ryan rolled his eyes, eager to talk about baseball or the latest video game. Helen, younger by 4 years, always listened more carefully, her big brown eyes watching her father as if he held the secrets of the world. Those were good years. We weren't rich, not at first, but we were happy. Edward worked late nights, sometimes falling asleep on the living room couch with papers spread around him. I would wake him with a blanket, whispering that he needed rest. He'd smile and say, "Just 1 more hour, Maggie. I'm close to something." He always was. By the time the company had 200 employees and clients across Illinois and beyond, Ryan was in college. He didn't want to study engineering or business. He liked marketing, fast money, the surface shine of success. Edward supported him anyway, though I could tell it disappointed him. He wanted his son to carry the values of the company, not just its name. When Edward collapsed in 2017, it was sudden. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning. He was 63. I can still remember the phone call, the way my knees gave out on the kitchen tile, the sharp sound of my mug breaking on the floor. The world tilted that day, not just for me, but for everyone who worked under him. Collins Tech lost its leader, and I lost my husband. After the funeral, the lawyers sat with me in the study. Papers spread across the mahogany desk. They explained what Edward had left. 40% of the company belonged to me. Another 10% came to me directly from his will. Ryan inherited the rest, at least on paper, though. Edward had left me a controlling voice if I wanted it. I remember looking at Ryan across the room, his face pale with grief, but also lit with something else. Ambition. He was 30 at the time, still unproven, but I wanted to believe in him. I told myself that giving him the reins would help him grow into the man his father hoped he could be. I stepped back. I thought my role was to grieve, to guide quietly, to let the next generation take charge. Helen supported the decision. She had no interest in corporate life. She was already carving her path as a designer in Milwaukee, sending me photos of her projects and reminding me to take care of myself. She called often, her voice soft and steady, always asking if Ryan was managing things all right. For a while, I tried to believe he was. I saw the cars first. A new BMW, then a Porsche within the year. Vacations to Europe, private photos on beaches in Italy with Tiffany and Jordan tagging along. The company credit cards paid for more than dinners with clients. They funded shopping sprees, first-class flights, luxury hotel suites. Employees whispered, but no one challenged him. The son of the founder was untouchable. I wanted to say something. I wanted to march into his office and remind him whose name was on the building. But I didn't. Every time I built up the courage, I told myself Edward would have wanted me to give Ryan room to lead. I thought silence was grace. Instead, silence became complicity. Looking back now, I see my mistake with painful clarity. By stepping aside, I left the door open for Ryan to believe the company was his personal kingdom. Collins Tech was never meant to be a playground for excess. It was supposed to be a lifeline for families, a workplace people could count on. Edward built it that way. And I, in my grief, let that legacy slip into Ryan's careless hands. The shame of it weighed on me, even as I sat in that restroom hours earlier, coke dripping from my hair. I could see Edward's face in my mind, the pride in his eyes the day the company reached its first $1 million in revenue, the way he held Ryan's shoulder and said, "Someday this will be yours. But don't ever forget who you are." Ryan had forgotten. Maybe I had too. I pressed my palms against the cool porcelain of the sink and admitted the truth to myself. I had abandoned the fight years ago. By stepping back, by letting him run unchecked, I had helped create the very arrogance that humiliated me today. The thought twisted in my chest, heavier than the coke-soaked blouse clinging to me. I hadn't just lost Edward. I had let Ryan's greed grow in the shadow of my silence. And now, walking through these hallways, I could see the consequences everywhere. Empty cubicles, tired faces, the company we once loved hanging by a thread. I wiped my hands, lifted my chin, and told myself the regret would not drown me this time. I couldn't undo the years I had given away. But I could stop the bleeding now. I could honor Edward's memory, protect the employees who still believed, and remind my son that this company was not his toy. The question was, how? How do you face your own child when he has become the very thing you fear most? I left the restroom, the faint smell of coke still clinging to me, and walked back into the office. The weight of the past pressed against me, but under it a spark of resolve flickered. This was no longer about grief or silence. It was about taking back what should never have been surrendered. The next morning, I walked the halls of Collins Tech as if I were a stranger in a place that once felt like home. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a dull glow on walls that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. Several doors bore nameplates of people long gone. The offices behind them, empty chairs pushed up against desks like abandoned outposts. I remembered when these halls rang with chatter and footsteps, when the energy of growth and possibility filled every corner. Back in 2017, before Edward passed, there had been more than 250 employees. Now, in 2023, fewer than 120 remained. The numbers didn't lie. Revenue had plummeted by nearly half. The company that once stood as a trusted partner to Fortune 500 clients was now a hollowed-out shell of itself. I paused outside the break room and caught the way two younger employees lowered their voices when Ryan's name was mentioned. They glanced around nervously, as if even speaking about him out loud might bring trouble. That wasn't respect. That was fear. At my desk, a small workstation shoved near the copy machines, I had been handed stacks of invoices to organize. It didn't take long to notice the red flags. Charges for luxury hotels in Miami labeled as client development. Receipts from high-end restaurants in Manhattan marked as operations expenses. Travel itineraries to Europe under the names of executives paid for with company cards marked training seminars. Training seminars, I nearly laughed. Edward used to fight with vendors over pennies to keep costs lean. Now his son was signing off on 5-star vacations. I didn't need to guess who was approving them. I saw the signatures myself. Greg Thompson, the CFO, scrawled his initials like a stamp of corruption on every line. He was in his mid-40s, slick hair and tailored suits, always with that heavy watch flashing under his cuff. He liked to lean in the doorway of Ryan's office, bragging about creative accounting as if theft could be dressed up in clever language. Then there was Tiffany Adams, operations director, who had been Ryan's drinking buddy in college. She walked the floor with an air of superiority, clicking her heels loud enough to remind everyone she was in charge. Whenever questions arose about budget excess, she'd wave them off with a laugh. It's all part of growth, she'd say, though the only thing growing was her expense account. Jordan. Lee, the marketing VP, spent more time scrolling his phone than building client relationships. I overheard him once telling Ryan, "Those old clients aren't worth it. Value Corp will make them irrelevant anyway." Edward had cultivated those clients for decades. They weren't just contracts. They were friendships, trust built over years. To hear them dismissed so casually made my blood run cold. Ashley Perez in HR completed the circle. She was the gatekeeper, smiling sweetly as she pushed out anyone who dared to question Ryan's choices. Seasoned employees with decades of loyalty were shown the door replaced with eager yes men who knew better than to object. Restructuring, she called it. I called it betrayal. From my small desk, I watched the pattern unfold day after day. Paper trails led to shell companies with names I'd never heard of, billing Collins Tech for services that didn't exist. Thousands of dollars funneled away with no accountability. My fingers trembled as I filed the documents, fury building inside me. At lunch, I carried a sandwich into the corner of the cafeteria, blending into the quiet hum of conversation. 2 women sat nearby, whispering, "Did you hear the Miller account is leaving? Can you blame them?" "We don't return calls anymore." One of them sighed, her voice heavy. "It wasn't like this when Mr. Collins was alive." I forced my eyes down, biting into bread that tasted like ash. They were right. Under Edward, clients were family. Employees had pride. Now the air was thick with tension, with resignation, with the sound of a sinking ship creaking under its own weight. In the late afternoon, as I carried a stack of files toward the finance office, I saw Ryan stroll past. His suit was sharp, his shoes polished, his cologne filling the air. He laughed with Greg, loud and careless. "Vegas next month," I heard him say. "Company card, of course." My hands tightened around the folders until the edges dug into my palms. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. Inside, my heart ached. This was Edward's legacy reduced to a playground for greed. I remembered the pride in his eyes when he showed me the first office he had rented, the one with peeling wallpaper and secondhand furniture. "It doesn't matter what it looks like," he had said. "What matters is what we build inside it." He built integrity, loyalty, something worth fighting for, and Ryan was tearing it apart piece by piece. I returned to my desk, sat down, and opened a drawer to hide the most suspicious documents. My pulse raced. Every fiber of me wanted to storm into Ryan's office, to slap the papers down in front of him and demand he stop. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not without proof strong enough to crush his denials. So I sat there, Coke stains still faint on the fabric of my blouse from the day before, watching him laugh as if nothing could touch him. The fury inside me was steady now, no longer just hurt. It was becoming resolve. I gathered the files into neat stacks, each page a piece of the puzzle. Each signature, each receipt, each bogus charge was a weapon waiting to be used. I slipped them into my bag, careful not to draw attention, and told myself this wasn't just about saving a company. It was about saving Edward's name, protecting the people who still showed up here every day, and proving that even in silence, I hadn't surrendered. The office lights flickered as I left that evening, shadows stretching down the empty hallway. The echo of my footsteps sounded lonelier than I remembered. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the battle was only beginning, and it would demand everything I had left to give. The memory came rushing back so vividly I could almost smell the flowers from that day. It was the spring of 2017, a week after Edward's funeral, when we gathered in the Collins Tech auditorium for his memorial service. The room had been filled with employees, clients, partners, people who had admired him not just as a businessman, but as a man of integrity. There were bouquets along the stage, photos of Edward smiling with his staff, shaking hands with clients. I had prepared a few words, nothing long, just a simple expression of gratitude and a promise to honor his legacy. When the program ended and they invited family members to speak, I stood up, clutching the small piece of paper I had written the night before. My hands trembled, but I was determined to honor the man who had given his life to this company and to us. As I stepped toward the podium, Ryan intercepted me. He was 30 then, in his dark suit, face set in grim determination. "Mom," he whispered harshly, gripping my arm before I could climb the steps. "Don't." I looked at him, startled. "Just a few words, Ryan. I owe it to him." His eyes flashed with something I hadn't seen before, a sharp impatience that made my chest tighten. And then, to my horror, he raised his voice loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Mom, you don't understand anything about this company. You shouldn't speak on business matters." The room fell silent. Faces turned toward us, employees shifting uncomfortably, partners whispering behind their hands. My cheeks burned as if the spotlight had turned on me. I froze there in front of hundreds of people who had once respected me as Edward's partner, now staring at me as if I were an intruder at my own husband's memorial. I lowered my eyes, nodded stiffly, and sat back down. The paper crumpled in my fist, unread. My throat ached from the words I had swallowed. Afterward, I stood outside near the stone steps of the building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. People offered condolences, but their eyes avoided mine as though Ryan's dismissal had confirmed that I didn't belong in the world Edward had built. Helen came to me then. She was only 24, her long brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail, her eyes red from crying. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "You should have spoken, Mom. Dad would have wanted you to." Tears finally spilled down my face as I held her. "He made me look like a fool, Helen, in front of everyone." She pulled back her gaze, fierce for someone so young. "Then prove him wrong. You were there through every late night, every tough call Dad made. Don't let Ryan erase that." I tried to believe her. But the humiliation of that moment carved something deep inside me, a hollow place where my voice should have been. That was the day I began to step back, convincing myself that silence was strength, that letting Ryan lead would honor Edward's wishes. But really, I was afraid of being diminished again in front of people who once respected me. Now, years later, as coke dripped down my face in that glass-walled conference room, I realized it was the same stage, just a different script. Ryan had humiliated me again publicly, deliberately stripping me of dignity with a smirk and a casual flick of his hand. The echo of "Clean it up, Janitor" carried the same sting as "Mom, you don't understand anything about this company." Both had reduced me to nothing in the eyes of others. But this time something inside me shifted. I walked back to my small desk after cleaning myself up, my hair still damp, my blouse sticky. I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened computer screen. Older now lines etched into my face, but my eyes were sharper. I didn't see the widow who had sat down in shame at Edward's memorial. I saw someone who had endured too much to remain silent again. Around me, the office buzzed with low voices. Greg joked loudly about quarterly numbers. Tiffany strutted past with a cup of coffee. Jordan laughed at something on his phone, and Ashley whispered with Ryan near his office door. They were too wrapped up in themselves to notice me watching. But I noticed them. I noticed every smirk, every indulgent laugh, every careless shrug at the company bleeding out beneath them. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt angry. I thought of Edward, of the lessons he had tried to pass on, of the nights he had fallen asleep with his tie loosened and a legal pad still in his hand. I thought of the employees who had whispered their frustrations in the cafeteria, afraid to speak louder. I thought of Helen's voice that day outside the memorial, "Prove him wrong." I whispered the words now under my breath. Never again. Ryan might believe he had silenced me forever. He might believe that coke on my face had broken me like it did years ago when he stopped me from honoring Edward. But he was wrong. I wouldn't let him humiliate me a third time. Not in this building, not in front of these people, not while Edward's name still hung above the doors. I straightened in my chair, gathered the files I'd been working on, and slid them neatly into a folder. My hands were steady now. The humiliation was still raw, but it had hardened into something else. Resolve. I swore to myself quietly, firmly, as the office lights hummed overhead. Ryan would never strip me of my dignity again. I was gathering files into a neat stack on my desk when a soft voice startled me. "You're new here, right?" I looked up to see a woman with dark hair pulled into a low bun, her eyes tired but sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She glanced around quickly before sitting on the edge of the desk beside mine. "Rachel Kim," she whispered, extending her hand. "Accounting? Well, what's left of it?" I shook her hand, keeping my expression neutral. "Margaret," I said simply. She leaned in closer. "Listen, I don't know what brought you here, but you should know what you're walking into. They've cut salaries across the board. Meanwhile, the executive team keeps giving themselves raises and bonuses." Her lips tightened. "I have the records to prove it." My heart kicked up a beat. I had been hoping to find someone like her, someone who still remembered what Collins Tech was supposed to stand for. "Records?" I asked, keeping my tone light as if we were discussing something as dull as office supplies. Rachel pulled a thin folder from her bag, glancing again at the hallway before sliding it toward me. Inside were spreadsheets with inflated consulting expenses and travel allowances marked as client meetings. I recognized the handwriting. Greg's signature at the bottom of every approval. "I've been keeping copies," she said, "in case someone actually cares enough to do something." People have tried speaking up before. Ashley Perez made sure they didn't last long. I looked up at her. They were fired. Fired, humiliated, escorted out by security. Rachel's voice carried both anger and resignation. She calls it restructuring. I call it cleaning house of anyone with integrity. The weight of her words pressed on me. For a moment, I saw Edward's office the way he used to beam when accountants showed him a clean quarter. He would have been sick to see this. Before I could respond, another voice cut in. "Mind if I sit?" A tall man with salt and pepper hair slid into the chair across from us, a worn Collins Tech badge clipped to his belt. He wore the weary look of someone who had been here too long to still believe in miracles. "David Miller, IT Systems. Don't worry," he added quickly, raising his hands. "I'm not here to rat anyone out. I've seen you looking at those invoices." "You're not wrong." Rachel stiffened. "Careful, David," he shrugged. "Careful doesn't keep this place afloat." "Look Margaret right." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I can get you into the back-end systems. The security is a joke. I've been telling them for years to update it, but of course, Ryan doesn't listen. Too busy spending money to care." My pulse quickened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been here since Edward hired me out of grad school," David said firmly. "This company used to mean something. Now Ryan's getting ready to sell us off to Value Corp for pennies just so he and his little circle can line their pockets with cushy contracts afterward." I forced myself to keep my face composed, though inside my blood boiled. "You've seen proof of this?" David gave a humorless laugh. "I've seen the emails. Ryan promising Value Corp that he can get them the company for $15 million. 15. When we were valued at 45 not that long ago?" Rachel muttered. "He's tanking us on purpose." The three of us sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the fluorescent lights above filling the space. Finally, I said quietly, "I need copies. Everything you have." David studied me, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Why you?" I held his gaze. "Because I still believe this company is worth saving." "Don't you?" His expression softened just enough. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I do." Rachel nodded, determination sharpening her features. "I'll handle the financials. David, you pull the digital records. Between us, we'll have enough to show what's really happening." A warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years. Hope. These two had no idea who I really was, but they still trusted me enough to share the risks. For the first time since I'd stepped back into Collins Tech, I didn't feel alone. That evening, long after most employees had gone home, Rachel returned to my desk with another folder. Salary reports. Notice the cuts. People making half of what they did under Mr. Collins. Meanwhile, she tapped the page showing Ryan and his team's salaries doubled in the same time frame. David appeared minutes later, laptop tucked under his arm. I mirrored the email server. Here's one you'll want to read. He pulled up a message from Ryan to Peter Wallace at Value Corp. The subject line read, "Agreement Terms." The message was clear. Ryan promised to push the sale through quickly and quietly in exchange for guaranteed consulting contracts for himself, Greg, Tiffany, Jordan, and Ashley. Once the deal closed... My stomach clenched as I read the words. Betrayal was too soft a word. This was sabotage. "They don't care about the rest of us," Rachel said bitterly. "Hundreds of families depend on these jobs, and he's ready to burn it all down." I closed the laptop, my hands steady though my heart raced. Then we stop him. Both of them looked at me, surprised by the conviction in my voice. I leaned in, my voice low but firm. "We gather everything. We document every lie, every theft. When the time comes, we show the truth to the right people. And Ryan won't be able to talk his way out of it." Rachel gave a small, tight smile. "It's dangerous, but worth it." David nodded. "Count me in." As they left that night, the office dark around us, I sat at my desk staring at the folder of stolen integrity. For years I had thought the spirit of Edward's company was gone. But here, in the courage of a weary accountant and an exhausted IT engineer, I felt it flicker back to life. I slipped the folder into my bag, turned off the desk lamp, and walked toward the elevators. The fight ahead would be ugly. Ashley had eyes everywhere, and one wrong move could put a target on Rachel or David. But I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't standing alone in the shadows. I had allies, and together we were going to bring the truth to light. I met Daniel Brooks at a quiet cafe on Wabash Avenue, far from the polished glass towers where men like Ryan liked to flaunt their power. Daniel looked almost exactly as I remembered him from years ago. Broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with silver eyes steady behind rectangular glasses. He had been one of Edward's closest friends, a lawyer who had helped draft the very bylaws that shaped Collins Tech. When he rose to greet me, his embrace carried the weight of old loyalty and shared grief. "Margaret," he said, pulling out my chair. "I'm sorry it took this long for you to call me. Edward would have wanted you to sooner." I know I admitted sitting down. But I thought Ryan would rise to the occasion. I wanted to believe in him. Daniel nodded, lips pressed together. He didn't say what we were both thinking. That belief had cost us too much. I slid the folder Rachel had given me across the table. Daniel opened it, leafing through pages of falsified expense reports, luxury trips, and fraudulent vendors. Then I showed him the flash drive David had prepared. "Emails with Value Corp," I explained. "Promises of selling the company far below value in exchange for personal contracts." Daniel's jaw tightened. He scrolled through one of the emails, then shut the laptop with deliberate care. "This is worse than I expected." I folded my hands on the table, forcing my voice not to shake. "Do I have the authority to stop him?" Daniel leaned forward. "Yes. You still hold 40% directly. Add Edward's 10% inheritance, you're at 50%. That's a controlling interest, Margaret. It's more than enough to challenge every action Ryan takes if you assert it." I let the words sink in. For years I had acted as if my ownership didn't matter, as if stepping back was my duty. Now here it was in black and white, the power had always been mine. I had just been too afraid to use it. "So what do we do?" I asked. Daniel's voice dropped lower. "We build a case that can't be denied. A board resolution authorizing you to act as majority owner. We subpoena financial records legally, not just from insiders like Rachel and David. We prepare to present this in a way that leaves no doubt. Not to Ryan, not to the board, not to the courts, if it comes to that." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, the warmth grounding me. "And Value Corp." He sighed. "If the sale goes through, undoing it would be nearly impossible. Once contracts are signed, their lawyers will bury us in litigation. You have to act before Ryan closes the deal." "How long do I have?" Daniel met my eyes. "Weeks, maybe less. The emails suggest he's trying to finalize by the end of the quarter." "That could mean days." My stomach knotted. The image of Ryan standing at the head of the conference table, Coke in hand, his voice dripping with contempt. "Clean it up, janitor," flashed across my mind. This was the man racing to dismantle his father's legacy for quick profit. "I'll do whatever it takes," I whispered. "I won't let him destroy what Edward built." Daniel studied me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "So, you need to understand what this means, Margaret. If we move forward, Ryan won't just be embarrassed. He could be exposed to federal charges." The words struck me like cold water. "Charges, wire fraud, securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty," Daniel listed calmly. "If he deliberately tanked the company to profit from the sale, that's not just bad leadership. That's criminal. He could face prison." I sat back, my breath caught in my chest. For all his arrogance, for all the humiliation he'd inflicted on me, Ryan was still my son. The thought of him behind bars twisted something deep inside me. But then I thought of Edward's employees, men and women whose paychecks kept food on their tables, being discarded so Ryan could pocket millions. I thought of the clients who had trusted Collins Tech for decades. I thought of the Coke dripping down my face as my son laughed. Margaret, Daniel said gently, "Are you ready for that possibility?" I closed my eyes for a moment. I saw Ryan as a boy chasing after a baseball in our yard, his father's laugh carrying across the grass. And then I saw the man he had become standing tall in his father's chair, sneering at the very people Edward had cherished. I opened my eyes and met Daniel's steady gaze. "If that's where the truth leads," I said, my voice steady now, "then yes, he will have to face it." Daniel nodded, pushing the folder back toward me. "Then we move quickly. I'll prepare the documents. You keep gathering evidence, but be careful. If Ashley or Greg suspect what you're doing, they'll try to shut you out. Or worse." I nodded, gripping the folder as if it were a shield. "I won't back down." We finished our coffee in silence, the city noise outside muffled by the cafe's windows. I thought of Edward again, the way he used to rest his hand on mine when decisions weighed heavy. "Do the right thing, Maggie," he would say. I rose, adjusted my coat, and held out my hand to Daniel. His grip was firm, steadying. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't thank me yet," he said. "We're about to start a war." As I stepped back into the crisp Chicago air, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on me. Fear still pulsed beneath the surface, but stronger than fear was resolve. For years I had stood in silence, letting Ryan define the future of Collins Tech. That silence was over, and for the first time since Edward's death, I felt like I was standing beside him again, ready to fight for the company we both loved. Helen showed up at my house one Saturday afternoon, her arms full of takeout containers from the little Thai place down the street. She looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much in your heart. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Edward used to read the paper on Sunday mornings, and she pushed a container toward me. "You need to eat," she said softly. "You look like you've been living on coffee." I smiled faintly, picking up a fork. "I've had worse diets." She was quiet for a while, watching me as I moved food around my plate more than I ate it. Finally, she set her fork down and leaned forward. "Mom, I don't recognize him anymore." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I knew exactly who she meant. "I don't either," I admitted. "He's become someone I don't understand." She rubbed her forehead with both hands. "Do you know what he said to me last week? He told me to stop coming around the office because it made him look weak, like he needed family to back him up. He said I should focus on my little decorating jobs and leave the real work to him." Anger flared in me, sharp and protective. "Your work is important, Helen. Don't you ever let him belittle you." Tears filled her eyes. "It wasn't even about me, Mom. It was about you. He mocked you in front of his team, said you wouldn't know the difference between a balance sheet and a grocery list." I wanted to scream at him. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "I know how much it hurts. But listen to me. This fight isn't about pride anymore. It's about saving what your father built. And it's about making sure Ryan can't drag all of us down with him. Helen's jaw tightened, her grip firm on my hands. Then let me help. I know a few people Dad trusted who left after Ryan took over. They might talk to me, not to you. I can get their stories proof of what really happened when Ryan pushed them out. A rush of gratitude swelled in my chest. That would help more than you know. But be careful, Helen. Ashley watches everything. She's not above intimidation. I can handle her, she said with a flash of determination. I'd seen only a handful of times before. She's not going to scare me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my daughter beside me in this fight. It eased something deep inside me the same way Edward's steady hand once had. Later that evening, after Helen left with promises to make calls first thing Monday, I sat in the living room with the television humming softly in the background. The front door creaked open, and a familiar small voice called out, "Grandma." Ethan bounded in his backpack, bouncing against his shoulders. My grandson had his father's eyes but his mother's gentleness. He hugged me around the waist before dropping his bag by the couch. "Your dad said you could come by," I asked. He nodded. "Mom dropped me off. Dad's still at work." I made him hot chocolate and we sat together on the couch. He kicked off his sneakers and curled his legs under him, sipping carefully so he wouldn't burn his tongue. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up at me with all the innocence of 12 years old and asked, "Grandma, why did Dad tell me you're just the cleaning lady at his office?" The words hit me harder than Ryan's Coke ever had. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "He told you that I asked quietly." Ethan nodded, frowning. "He said you shouldn't bother people there because all you do is clean up. But you don't look like a cleaning lady. You make really good cookies." I laughed softly, though my eyes stung. "Thank you, sweetheart. There's nothing wrong with being a cleaning lady. It's honest work." "But your dad—" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes he says things that aren't true. About me, about other people." Ethan looked confused. "But why? You're his mom." I stroked his hair back from his forehead, my throat tight. "I wish I had an answer for you. All I can tell you is that I love you and I always will. And one day you'll understand everything better." He leaned against me, content with that for now, sipping his chocolate. I held him close, my heart aching with the weight of his question. Ryan's cruelty wasn't just hurting me anymore. It was shaping the way his son saw the world. After Ethan left that night, the house felt unbearably quiet. I walked into Edward's old study, the books still lined neatly on the shelves, his framed diploma from Northwestern hanging on the wall. I ran my fingers along the edge of his desk and whispered, "I can't let him do this, Edward. Not to our company, not to our grandson." The vow settled deep in my bones. This wasn't only about saving a business. It was about making sure Ethan grew up knowing that lies and arrogance don't win in the end, that his grandmother wasn't a janitor in the eyes of the world, but a woman who fought for the truth. And I knew then that no matter how ugly this battle became, I couldn't back down. Late one afternoon, I lingered in the hallway outside the executive conference room, pretending to sort through a pile of files. The frosted glass didn't block sound as well as they thought, and voices carried easily into the corridor. Ryan's voice rose above the rest, smooth and smug, the kind of tone he used when he thought everyone in the room existed only to applaud him. "You know," he said with a laugh, "even my own mother isn't worth much. She's better off pushing a mop. That's all she's ever been good for, cleaning up after other people." The words cut into me like shards of glass. My throat tightened, and I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the file stack until my knuckles whitened. I forced myself to stay silent, to breathe, to listen. This wasn't just idle cruelty. It was proof of who he had become. Inside, laughter broke out from a few of his allies, the hollow, obedient kind. Then another voice spoke up, trembling but clear enough. It belonged to Mr. Hanley, a senior project manager who had been with Collins Tech since the early days. He had gray hair now, but I remembered him when Edward first hired him fresh out of school. Ryan Hanley said cautiously with respect, "Some of us still believe in the values your father built here. Cutting corners, mocking family. This isn't what Collins Tech was about." Silence followed for a beat. Then Ryan's chair screeched back against the floor. His voice turned sharp, venomous. If you don't like how I run things, Hanley, maybe you'd be happier cleaning toilets with my mother. Go join the janitorial staff. That seems to be the family tradition." The room erupted with nervous chuckles, but no one dared defend the man who had just been humiliated. I peeked through the sliver of glass and saw Hanley's shoulders sag as he gathered his notes. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at Ryan. He simply walked out of the room, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. The silence after the door closed was heavier than any sound. Ryan adjusted his tie and smirked. "Anyone else want to complain?" No one answered. Heads dropped. The meeting went on as if nothing had happened. From my hidden place in the hallway, my chest burned. Tears stung my eyes, not just for myself, but for the man who had given decades to this company only to be dismissed like trash. I pressed the files tighter to my chest and willed myself not to cry, not here, not where someone could see weakness. I remembered Edward telling me once, "Maggie, the measure of a leader isn't how he treats the boardroom. It's how he treats the people no one notices." Ryan had failed that test 1,000 times over. He had forgotten or maybe never learned what real leadership looked like. I slipped quietly down the hallway, away from the conference room. Each step felt heavy, my shoes sinking into the carpet. But beneath the weight was a spark of something hotter, sharper. Anger had always been there, but this was different. This was clarity. I sat down at my small desk, the hum of the copy machine filling the silence. My hands shook as I pulled open my drawer where I kept the folders Rachel and David had already shared. Emails, invoices, doctored reports. Proof of what Ryan had done. For weeks I had been collecting evidence, telling myself I would act when the time was right. Now I knew the time was coming soon. Ryan wasn't just careless. He wasn't just greedy. He was cruel. And cruelty had a way of eating through everything it touched. People, families, legacies. I wouldn't let him destroy what Edward had built, and I wouldn't let Ethan grow up thinking this was what power looked like. From the corner of my eye, I saw Rachel pass by. Her brow furrowed, her arms loaded with binders. She glanced at me briefly, almost as if she knew I had heard. She gave the smallest nod, a silent confirmation that we were in this together. That night, when the office emptied and the building grew quiet, I stayed behind. I sat at my desk, spreading the papers out under the desk lamp. Each document was a weapon. Each email a nail in Ryan's coffin. I imagined the boardroom filled with Value Corp executives, Ryan beaming as he announced the sale. And then I imagined stepping into that room not as the janitor he mocked, but as the rightful owner, the one with 50% control, the one holding the truth in her hands. The thought steadied me. My humiliation no longer mattered. The coke in my hair, the whispers in the cafeteria, the smirks behind my back. They had forged something inside me stronger than pride. I gathered the folders, slid them into my bag, and turned off the lamp. The city lights glittered outside the windows as I walked to the elevator, their reflection flickering across the glass like a promise. The day was coming when Ryan's laughter would stop, and when it did, the silence would speak louder than any insult he had ever thrown at me. The conference room gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, its long, polished table set with water glasses and leather-bound folders. Ryan stood at the head shoulders, squared the picture of confidence. To his right, Greg had already queued up the slides, and Tiffany leaned forward with her notepad as though she were indispensable. Jordan scrolled idly on his phone, ready to chime in when called, and Ashley's sharp eyes scanned the room for any hint of dissent. The door opened and Peter Wallace walked in, flanked by 2 attorneys in dark suits. At 52, the Value Corp CEO radiated practiced charm, shaking Ryan's hand with a firm grip. "Ryan," he said smoothly, "it's good to finally be here in person. Let's make this official." Ryan smiled, his teeth flashing. "Absolutely, Peter. Collins Tech is ready for its next chapter." He gestured toward the screen. "Greg, let's show them the numbers." The lights dimmed and a slide lit up the wall graphs sloping downward, carefully crafted to look dire. As you can see, Greg began his tone-rehearsed revenues have struggled, margins are tight. But with Value Corp's resources, this acquisition will ensure stability and growth. I stood in the hallway just beyond the glass doors, dressed not in the drab clothes of an assistant, but in the kind of suit Edward once bought me for board dinners. Navy wool tailored crisp. My hair was styled, my makeup subtle but deliberate. Gone was the disguise, the lowered voice, the hidden posture. This was me. The widow of the founder, the majority owner, the woman Ryan had mistaken for nothing. I pushed the door open. The quiet creak turned every head. Ryan's voice faltered. "What the hell?" I stepped inside, my heels clicking against the floor. "Good afternoon." I moved to the opposite end of the table, my gaze sweeping the room, landing last on my son. "I am Margaret Collins, Ma, and I am the majority shareholder of Collins Tech." A ripple moved through the room. Peter's brows drew together, the attorneys whispering quickly to one another. Ryan's face drained of color. Mom," he stammered, his voice cracking. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done a long time ago," I said calmly. The door opened again, and Daniel Brooks entered his presence, commanding in a dark gray suit. He carried a slim briefcase which he set on the table before opening it with precision. As counsel for Mrs. Collins, he said, handing documents across to Value Corp's lawyers, "We are asserting her 50% controlling interest. Any transaction without her approval would be null and void." Ryan lunged forward, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. She's not involved. She hasn't been for years." I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. Maybe that was my mistake, but I'm here now. Before he could argue, the screen behind him flickered. Greg frowned, tapping at the laptop. Then the first slide disappeared, replaced by an email header. Rachel Kim appeared in the doorway. Her chin lifted, David just behind her with a small remote in hand. "What is this?" Tiffany hissed, pushing back in her chair. The words of the email filled the screen, Ryan's name in bold at the top. Subject agreement terms. My breath caught even though I'd already read it. Ryan's promises to Peter Wallace, the guarantee that the company would sell for $15 million, less than half its worth, followed by assurances of lucrative consulting contracts for the executive team once the sale was complete. Gasps rose around the table. One of Value Corp's attorneys leaned closer to Peter, speaking in urgent whispers. "Turn that off," Ryan shouted, spinning on David. "You don't have authorization." David's voice was calm, steady. "I had all the authorization I needed when I saw you gutting this company." Another slide came up, expense reports with suspicious vendor names, identical handwriting on checks, supposedly from different companies. Rachel's voice cut through the rising tension. "This is fraud. Systematic, deliberate fraud." Greg slammed his hands on the table. "That's enough. You can't." Daniel's voice sliced cleanly through the noise. "Actually, we can. And the board will see every document we've compiled. Unless you'd prefer we go directly to the attorney's office." The room went silent. I looked at Ryan. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight, his hands gripping the table as though he could steady himself against the tide turning against him. For years I had held my tongue, let him run wild, but not today. "You thought you could sell your father's company for scraps," I said, my voice low but carrying. "You thought you could humiliate me into silence. But the truth has a way of surfacing, Ryan. And today everyone sees it." Peter Wallace cleared his throat. His polished composure cracked at the edges. "These are serious allegations. I wasn't aware of—" Rachel clicked again, pulling up another slide. This time it was Value Corp's own correspondence. Lines of text confirmed their knowledge of inflated figures, their promises of consulting incentives. Peter's face hardened, but not with anger at us. With fear. His lawyers leaned close, speaking rapidly, their pens scratching notes. The balance of power had shifted. Ashley whispered to Ryan, her face pale now, too. Tiffany looked ready to bolt. Jordan finally set down his phone, his usual smirk gone. I stood straighter, letting the silence stretch. Every eye in that room was on me. Not as the janitor, not as the grieving widow, but as the rightful guardian of Collins Tech. And in that silence, for the first time in years, I felt Edward's presence as though he were standing just behind me, steadying my shoulders the way he used to. I moved to the front of the room, each step steady, the weight of years of silence lifting with every word I spoke. "Here is the truth," I said, my voice carrying through the stunned conference room. This company wasn't failing because the market turned. It wasn't failing because our clients abandoned us. It was failing because of deliberate mismanagement, because money meant for salaries and operations was siphoned away to line the pockets of the people sitting at this table. I pointed toward the screen. David clicked and the next slide appeared. Rows of transactions to shell companies with names that sounded legitimate, until you saw the addresses all traced back to a single post office box in Evanston. Millions funneled into false vendors, I continued, all signed off by Greg Thompson, our CFO. Greg's face flushed red. "That's a mischaracterization." "It's theft," I cut in my tone sharp enough to slice through his protest. "Plain and simple." Another slide. Emails between Ryan and Peter Wallace at Value Corp, subject lines littered with words like incentives and personal contracts. Rachel read aloud one line, her voice steady. Value Corp agrees to provide annual consulting retainers totaling $2 million to be distributed among the executive team contingent on sale completion at $15 million. The silence that followed was suffocating. One by one, heads turned toward Ryan. Some employees pressed hands over their mouths. From the back of the room, I heard a whisper ripple through the staff who had gathered to witness. "She's the real owner. She's the one protecting us." Ryan shoved his chair back, standing tall, his voice rising with desperation. "You can't believe this. This is just my mother." Bitter, jealous, trying to steal back control. I met his eyes, my calm, a stark contrast to his panic. Jealous. "No, Ryan, I am ashamed. Ashamed of myself for letting you run unchecked, but no longer." Peter Wallace cleared his throat, his polished charm gone. "Value Corp will be withdrawing from these negotiations effective immediately. We will of course cooperate with any federal inquiries." His lawyers were already closing their briefcases, their faces grim. They left quickly, the door shutting with a finality that echoed in the room. I turned back to the table of executives who had propped Ryan up all these years. "Greg Thompson," I said firmly, "you are terminated effective immediately for financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Security will escort you out." Greg shot to his feet, sputtering. "You can't do this. I have a contract." "Broken by your fraud," Daniel interjected coldly, handing him a notice. "Consider this your formal termination. I didn't let the momentum falter." "Tiffany Adams," I continued, eyes locking on her. "You are terminated for approving unlawful expenses and contributing to the misuse of company funds." Her smirk faltered. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She rose stiffly, gathering her bag. "Jordan Lee." I said terminated for deliberately sabotaging client relationships to favor Value Corp subsidiaries. His face went white, his phone slipping from his hand onto the table with a sharp clatter. "And Ashley Perez." My voice hardened, terminated for systematically removing whistleblowers and enabling misconduct at every level. Her lips parted, but the smugness she once carried was gone. She lowered her eyes and stood slowly, folding her arms tight across her chest, as if bracing herself. Each one left under the watch of security, their footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. I let the room breathe in what had just happened before turning to face my son. Ryan stood rigid, his fists clenched, his face pale but defiant. "You can't fire me," he said, his voice almost a growl. "I'm the CEO. This is my company." I straightened my shoulders, my voice firm, clear, and unshakable. "No, Ryan. This is not your company. This was your father's company, and now it belongs to its rightful shareholders and employees. And as of this moment, you are relieved of your duties as Chief Executive Officer of Collins Tech." Gasps filled the room. Employees looked from him to me, disbelief etched on their faces. Ryan slammed his hand on the table. "I'll sue you. I'll destroy you. You think you can just walk in here and—" I took a step closer, lowering my voice but keeping it strong. "You destroyed yourself, Ryan. Every document, every email, every signature. It all tells the story of what you chose to become. If you want to sue, then be prepared to face the counterclaims the board and possibly the federal courts." For the first time I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not arrogance, not confidence, but fear. His mouth opened, then closed, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He looked around the room for support, but his allies were gone, escorted out with their belongings. From the back, a few employees began to clap softly. Then more joined the sound spreading until it filled the conference room. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady as if to say, finally. I stood there breathing deeply, letting the moment settle. Years of humiliation and silence had led to this. Ryan's reign was over, and for the first time since Edward's death, Collins Tech was mine to protect again. Ryan did exactly what I expected him to do. He filed a lawsuit against me. His lawyers stormed into court claiming I had orchestrated a coup, that I had stolen the company from its rightful chief executive. For weeks, the headlines speculated. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, and I walked in each morning with Daniel by my side. The judge listened patiently as Ryan's counsel spoke about betrayal and family discord. But when our turn came, Daniel laid the documents neatly before the bench. The stock certificates, Edward's will, the proxy rights, the board resolutions. More than that, he produced the evidence Rachel and David had uncovered. Emails, forged vendor accounts, contracts with Value Corp, promising kickbacks. It was over before it truly began. The court dismissed Ryan's claims with prejudice, affirming me as the controlling shareholder of Collins Tech. The media swarmed the story. Articles painted Ryan as the greedy heir who tried to gut his father's company. Reporters dug up every detail of the lavish trips, the cars, the personal expenses disguised as corporate costs. Headlines read, "Fallen CEO under investigation for fraud." Every day the phone rang with requests for comment, but I rarely spoke. The truth spoke loudly enough. Within weeks, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into Ryan's actions. His name was stripped from industry boards, invitations to conferences dried up, and partners who once shook his hand eagerly now pretended not to know him. He tried to find work in the tech sector, but no one wanted to touch him. Eventually, word spread that he'd taken a position at a small real estate office in Naperville, answering phones and filing paperwork. For a man who once strutted through my husband's company as though he were untouchable, the fall was brutal. At Collins Tech, life began to shift. We rebuilt piece by piece. Rachel took over as Chief Financial Officer, her calm precision guiding us through the tangled mess Ryan left behind. She rebuilt our financial statements from scratch, showing us what we truly had and what could be salvaged. David became Chief Technology Officer, finally allowed to repair the broken systems he had begged Ryan to fix. He modernized the network, secured our data, and brought back the efficiency Edward had once prized. Helen joined us part-time, using her natural charm and empathy to reconnect with clients who had nearly abandoned us. She picked up the phone, not with polished pitches, but with sincerity. "I'm Edward Collins's daughter," she would say, "and I promise you we are different now." Clients who had drifted away began to return. I remember the day I stood in the cafeteria, the entire staff gathered as I addressed them. Starting this month, I announced all salary cuts imposed under Ryan's leadership are reversed. Every single one of you deserves better. For a moment there was silence, and then applause broke out, growing louder until it filled the room. Some employees had tears in their eyes. One man raised his hand and said, "Mrs. Collins, thank you for giving us our company back." I smiled, my chest tight with emotion. "No," I told them. "Thank you for not giving up on it." That night, after the last light in the building dimmed, I walked to the corner office that had once been Edward's. I hadn't stepped inside in years. His leather chair still stood behind the oak desk worn at the arms where his hands used to rest. The shelves were lined with books he had read and reread, their spines cracked from years of use. A photograph of us taken on the steps of the old office when the company was just beginning still sat in a silver frame. I lowered myself into his chair, the leather creaking under my weight. For the first time since he died, I felt something close to peace. Not victory, not triumph, but peace. I closed my eyes and let the quiet surround me. For years, this office had been a place of power and pride for my husband. Tonight, it became a sanctuary for me, a place where I could finally breathe, finally believe that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be all right. Spring came to Chicago with a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. The air outside the Collins Tech building smelled of rain and new beginnings, and for once the halls inside carried the same spirit. Where silence and fear had once lived, there was now conversation and laughter. Desks that had sat empty for years were filled again with new hires. The reception area buzzed with greetings, clients arriving not with complaints but with renewed trust. We had signed 2 major contracts within the last month, one with a long-term client who returned after Helen's persistence, another with a firm who said plainly, "We came back because we trust you now." Those words had meant more to me than the ink on the page. For the first time since Edward's death, I could look at the balance sheet and see growth. Not reckless, not inflated, but real. One afternoon, Helen arrived at the office with Ethan in tow. My grandson ran down the hallway, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, his laughter carrying into the conference rooms. "Grandma," he shouted, throwing his arms around me. I held him tightly, breathing in the smell of his hair, a simple sweetness that washed away the bitterness of the past months. "You've gotten taller," I told him. He grinned. "I've been eating my vegetables." Helen watched us, her smile tired but content. "He begged me to come see you," she said. "He wanted to know if this place really feels different." I looked around at the busy office employees waving as they passed. "It does," I said softly. "It finally feels like home again." Later that week, I stayed late going over reports in Edward's old office. The sun dipped low over the skyline, painting the windows gold. A knock came at the door. When I looked up, Ryan stood there. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. He wasn't the polished executive who once strutted these halls. His suit was wrinkled, his face thinner shadows beneath his eyes. He stepped inside, slowly closing the door behind him. "Mom," he said quietly. I set down my pen and folded my hands. "Ryan." He looked at the floor, then at me as though the words weighed more than he could carry. "I was afraid of you," he admitted. "Afraid you'd always be better than me, smarter, stronger. I thought if I could push you out, humiliate you, then maybe I could feel like I was in control. But all I did was destroy everything Dad built and hurt the only person who ever wanted me to succeed." His voice broke on the last words, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. I searched his face, seeing not the arrogant man who had thrown coke in my face, but the boy who once clung to Edward's hand in the front yard. I rose from my chair, walked to him, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "What's important now isn't the mistakes you made," I said gently. "It's what you choose to do with the time you have left. You've fallen, Ryan, but you don't have to stay there." He nodded, his eyes glassy. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mom. I just needed to tell you the truth." I gave a small, sad smile. The truth is a good place to start. When he left, I sank back into Edward's chair. My heart ached, but it was a different ache now. Less rage, more release. Ryan's confession didn't erase the damage, but it gave me something I hadn't expected: closure. That night, as the office lights dimmed, I stood by the window watching the city pulse with life. Collins Tech had survived betrayal, humiliation, near collapse. And so had I. I realized then what Edward had always known: true power isn't found in titles or boardrooms and balance sheets or flashy presentations. True power lies in dignity, in standing for justice, in protecting what matters, and in giving people the chance to rise even after they've fallen. If you've ever been dismissed, humiliated, or told you were nothing, remember this: your truth and your dignity are worth more than any insult hurled your way. Share your thoughts with me and let me know if my story touched something in you. Because sometimes the only thing we need to keep going is to know we aren't alone.